Welcome to Three Count Commentaries. Today we're going to talk about Omega Man, a wrestling love story, a TSN documentary released in 2019 about Kenny Omega. So I came into this thing with an open mind. Contrary to popular belief, I do not hate Kenny Omega. I do believe that Kenny Omega is probably one of the most overrated wrestlers of all time, and certainly the most overrated wrestler of the 2010s. But I don't hate Kenny Omega. To bolster my point about Kenny Omega being massively overrated, within the first 3 minutes of this documentary, I am slapped in the face with some of the most offensive comparisons I have quite frankly heard in a really long time. The director of this project, the guy's name is Young Chong. I think he's Japanese. He probably Chinese, I would imagine. He says that Kenny Omega is like Robert De Niro or Al Pacino as a performer, that he's so emotionally connected into his ring work, and said that wrestling is all about emotional connections. Well, at least I agree with that part. But to compare Kenny Omega to Robert De Niro or Al Pacino, come on, man. I said again, I came into this thing with an open mind. But you're telling me, oh, he's like Al Pacino. He's like Robert De Niro. It's like, come on. Do you have to lay it on so thick early? Sheesh. Literally like 2 or 3 minutes later, Chris Jericho was in this documentary, and he says that Kenny Omega is like Elvis, if Elvis was a wrestler. I'm like, what? Are you people serious? I get that you want people to engage with your subject, but he cannot live up to this hype, right? For most people, you have never heard of Kenny Omega. How could you have this Al Pacino, Robert De Niro level performer that you have no earthly idea exists? You could be a wrestling fan and probably have never heard the name Kenny Omega in 2019 outside of the dirt sheets. All right. So the idea, this is what I mean by he's the most overrated performer of the 2010s, without a shadow of a doubt. This didn't even change my mind on that. So I had to continue going through this thing, knowing that these people think that he's Elvis all of a sudden, that the sun shines out of Kenny Omega's ass. Whatever. Anyway, one of the weak points of the documentary that I didn't like is that we heard almost nothing about his home life, whether he's got siblings, what was growing up like for him in Winnipeg. We didn't get almost none of that. Thankfully, there was a Slam Wrestling article. Slam Wrestling is based in Canada, so they talk to a lot of Canadian pro wrestlers, and I can go to fill in the blanks. So Kenny Omega grew up as a fan of the Ultimate Warrior, but due to his size, he never thought he could be like the Ultimate Warrior, so he became more of a fan of like the Rockers and the Hart Foundation. And that's really where he gets a lot of his inspiration from in terms of wrestling. So even though the documentary doesn't tell us about that, thankfully I do extra reading. So there we go. Anyway, we pick up the story in the documentary. He's a young man, 16, 17 years old. And he's going to have his first match in was essentially a strip club. So according to his interview with Slam Wrestling, he came up with, again, his first gimmick was that he was a surfer. Similar to, I guess, Sting. I don't know. But he says that basically he's from Winnipeg. He knows nothing about surfing. So he pretty much gave that up. He ended up coming up with the name Kenny Omega. Now the name Omega, this is all from his Slam Wrestling interview, because the documentary doesn't tell you any of this, is that he came up with the name Omega from Final Fantasy VIII, which had I think it's a monster. I'm not sure if it's a gun blade or not, but it's called Omega Weapon. And he always liked that. He's a big fan of the Final Fantasy series. So he took the name Omega. I thought that just Kenny went with it. So instead of using his real name, he decided to go with Kenny Omega. So that's the name. That's where he comes from. So Kenny Omega is wrestling for Pro Wrestling Noah over in Japan, where he's noticed by Johnny Ace and invited down to Deep South Wrestling. Now in the documentary, they mentioned that the WWE system basically tears people down and builds them back up. And he felt like everything that made him unique was being beaten out of him and stripped away. And he didn't want to do that. He wanted to do pro wrestling his own way. In the Slam Wrestling article, he mentions that a lot of the politics of the WWE system. You know, there's a lot of guys who were just in it for the money, and he wasn't. He was in it for the art. He talks a lot about, you know, the art form in the documentary, that he's basically just in it for the art, while in WWE, a lot of these people are in it for the money. He felt like a lot of kiss asses and a lot of politics, and he didn't want anything to do with it. In addition, he's a smaller guy, and he felt like, well, other people were speaking for him and saying essentially that the junior heavyweights have a rough time in WWE. And his job was mostly to make those guys look good. And we know that a lot of those guys probably were not the best wrestlers, and they didn't have the passion. So essentially he became disillusioned and he quit. So that's pretty consistent with what I know from his time. So then he starts talking about how in 2006 he's left WWE developmental. He thinks it's all over. He doesn't think that, you know, he's going to make it too far. So he goes back to Winnipeg, and he wrestled at a place called Premier Championship Wrestling. And it actually shows some really good footage of him having a match with AJ Styles. AJ Styles is he's in, of course, TNA at the time, but he works this indie show in Winnipeg, and he puts over Kenny Omega. And then afterwards, he says Kenny Omega did two things right. One was getting that good win over him, which is, I think, was with a roll up or something, and the second was quitting that crap promotion, WWE. So he felt validated, and a lot of other people felt validated too, that WWE just wasn't for him, which, you know, it's not for everybody. And that part is absolutely true. Of course, AJ Styles ended up going to WWE, but that would be about 10 years after this. So the documentary says that Omega just wanted to be himself, didn't really want to have a gimmick per se, just wanted to basically be himself as a character. And growing up, he was a big fan of the Japanese style. Meltzer is in the documentary saying that, oh, the Japanese style is so much cleaner, it's so much more hard-hitting, it's so much more athletic, it's just better, it's just the best. So Omega decides to go to Japan because WWE is not a good place for him, and he decides that everything that he loves comes from Japan. You know, the video games, the anime, the everything. So he goes over there to Japan, and he gets told by a wrestling promoter to make a video. Basically, just you have to make a video in order to get into, I think it was DDT at the time. So they have footage of Kenny Omega doing a wrestling match, quote unquote. It's more of a cinematic fight scene in his cottage home in Winnipeg. Him and this guy are wrestling in the kitchen. They're wrestling outside. They're wrestling outside on a dock, you know, near water. And he's like Hadouken the guy into the water. It's really over the top and crazy. And that was what got him into DDT. I gotta say, the home movie wrestling match thing, it was very silly. It was very over the top. But considering I'm familiar with Kenny Omega, it is absolutely something within his character to do. So it was very over the top. So he talks about doing DDT, and basically everything was fair game. There was nothing that was off limits. It was completely different from his time in WWE and some of the other places that he had been, because it allowed for greater freedom. And you see DDT, they're doing a lot of things like wedgies and smacking each other on the butt and all this other weird stuff. He then talks about intergender wrestling and watching women's wrestling for the first time in Japan, and, you know, the passion of the business really excited him. And then he goes into the match with the little girl, which I found to be interesting, actually. So he says that he took the match with the little girl, knowing that it might ruin his career. But Haruka, the child, was just a fan who wanted to get into the ring, and he was given all that she could do. You know, somebody apparently walked him through what the girl could do. And he says that he wanted to do this match to show people what wrestling could really be. That he didn't want to have an old school mentality. And he knows a lot of old school people. I know he was talking about Jim Cornette, but Jim Cornette's name was never mentioned. But he said he wanted to use wrestling to unify, not to divide. And they wanted wrestling to be something that it could be something anybody could do. And basically there were no boundaries. And essentially saying that's what DDT was all about, was not having too much in the way of boundaries when it comes to wrestling. Now, I had never heard of Kenny Omega talking about wrestling this little girl before. So it was very interesting to get his perspective on it. I'm not saying I was impressed by his perspective on it, because I wasn't. But I see where he was going with this, but you also have to take into account this guy. He's got nothing going for him really. DDT is not even is it the number 4 wrestling promotion in Japan at the time? Who knows? But it's not like he was taking a huge risk as a main event guy that was going in there wrestling a little girl. He was a low card guy that went in there and wrestled a little girl, and it got him a lot of attention. And it's the same thing when they wrestle the blow up doll. It's just, this is what this company does. They do a lot of silly stuff. But it also shows that he is trying to eschew boundaries. And this is something that, of course, we're going to talk about in a minute when we're talking about the Golden Lovers and stuff like this, is trying to eschew boundaries and use wrestling to unify as many people as you can, capture the imagination of people who are kind of on the outside and not really sure about wrestling. Of course, I think this kind of stuff is very divisive, because I don't understand how you can have a competitive contest with a little girl, but this is what those people over there and his hardcore fans believe is entertaining. I don't find it to be entertaining, but it's not for me. Now we get into the real meat of the documentary, why the documentary even exists in the first place. Now, we got to back up a little bit, because there was no mention of Ring of Honor in this documentary. Of course, we know that Kenny Omega worked for Ring of Honor. The Slam Wrestling interview that I've been referencing so far talks about him signing a contract to Ring of Honor in like 2009. And he talked about Ring of Honor being a fast-paced, bang-for-your-buck style promotion. And that's really why he signed there. He thought that was the best pro wrestling in the United States, etc., etc. But definitely he was against a lot of the WWE's theatrics, which for a guy who wrestled a little girl, a guy who put his fingers in another guy's butt, a guy who's wrestled guys who did blow up dolls, I find the idea that you're some kind of raw and rough pro wrestler is very bizarre. But that's just me. So the Golden Lovers. He talked about Kota Ibushi in the documentary. Basically, he saw Kota Ibushi and figured this was a guy who had the same mentality about wrestling that I have. That, he is a guy who wants to, stretch the creativity as far as possible and to see what they could bring out together. And Kota Ibushi accepts the match with him, and they work together. And Kota Ibushi, after the match, says that, he's in the documentary, of course, the Japanese subtitles. He says basically like one brain for two people, and that they come from different cultures, speak different languages, eat different food, but they have the same mentality about pro wrestling. And this becomes the story of the Golden Lovers. Now, I never knew where the name came from and how long they were partners and all this kind of stuff. But this documentary did really give me a good idea about the story of the Golden Lovers. So, Rachel Giuliani, who is they put her in the documentary as a cultural critic. When I Googled her, it seems that all she does is like gay podcasts and talks about queerness in wrestling. Okay. She had purple hair. Okay. Anyway, the Kota Ibushi Kenny Omega tag team, they were about doing, tag team moves. This is why it's important for the documentary to tell you who his inspirations are, because a lot of the Ibushi Omega tag team matches were basically where they were the rockers. They would do moves together, double drop kicks from the top rope. They were doing double 450 splashes, all this kind of stuff where they were in sync, which is basically what he took from the rockers. And these guys were doing this in their tag team matches, of course, to the next level because they're more athletic and it's a different time. So you could see the influence of the rockers in the Kota Ibushi Kenny Omega tag team. And then WrestlePro magazine referred to them as the Golden Twins. And they didn't have a name yet. So Kota Ibushi is telling the story how, in the magazine they're calling them the Golden Twins. And then they were given a chance to do an interview. And they called themselves the Golden Lovers. So they came up with the Golden Lovers part themselves. And then they basically started playing into it. They would do cute videos together where, they would look at each other lovingly. They would kiss and all this kind of stuff. And this sort of bust open the boundaries of homosexuality in pro wrestling. And later, they talk about this, that, homosexuality was something that in wrestling, it was always played for a joke. And there is some truth to that. Now, while they're talking about homosexuality in wrestling being played for a joke, they're showing B-roll of Gorgeous George. Gorgeous George was not gay. Gorgeous George not only was not gay, his character was not gay. The character was flamboyant, but the character was not gay. They show Adrian Street, which, there was some homosexual elements to Adrian Street, especially when it comes to kissing men and things like that. Now, the homosexual character was always had an element of menace to it. Like Adrian Street would have, the lipstick and the makeup and all this kind of stuff, but he always kind of played it up as being hyper violent. I don't know how many people actually know this, but Adrian Street used to make songs. And he would talk about how he would love to hurt people. He was almost like a sadist, a lot like Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. That was kind of the idea. And Goldust was the same way. Goldust would have, the Razor Ramon heart on his chest and all this kind of stuff. But in the end, there was an underlying threat and element of creepiness to Goldust that made him sort of menacing. But the Golden Lovers was lighthearted. They were playing around with it. And Kenny Omega talked about, hey, these same-sex relationships in wrestling, while in the past they were played for jokes, now we're doing it in a way that will create acceptance for a lot of gay fans who are, now buying into the gimmick, because now it's not only is this something that is lighthearted and sort of fun, but it's not being played for jokes. We're not heels. We're not bad guys. We're not creeps or anything like that. So it's made it more accepting. And he is given a whole lot of credit for opening up pro wrestling to a largely female, largely LGBT audience. And this is where we get some wrestling fans in here who are of the LGBT variety. And these people are talking about how much they love the Golden Lovers and how much they love the story and how Kenny Omega helped them with their confidence. And I think this is probably the best thing he had brought to the business in terms of bringing something in a way that you can't, it's really good because you're blurring the lines. Kenny Omega never says up front whether he's gay or not. And even as they discuss it, the Golden Lovers throughout the documentary, it's never mentioned that if either one of them are gay, right? It's not even a matter of whether they're gay or not. And, this is where you get Kenny Omega's parents, where his dad is kind of like, does it really even matter if he's gay? What is it gay for a man to tell another man that he loves him because they share a bond and all this sort of stuff? And I'm like, okay, because kayfabe is about blurring the lines. And for years and years, nobody ever says that Kenny Omega is gay. Nobody ever said that Kota Ibushi is gay. They do gay stuff, but nobody ever knows whether that's gimmick or whether that's real or what's going on here. And that's what wrestling is all about. Wrestling is all about kayfabe, blurring the lines between reality and fiction. And they did it very well, because here it is, 2024, and I still don't know whether these guys are gay or not. I still don't know. I would imagine it's more like a Queen Latifah thing with Kenny Omega, where he's not probably ever going to say it, but it's pretty much implied. Anyway, they talk about the breakup of the Golden Lovers and how this became a sort of 10-year story. They united in DDT. They were an incredibly popular tag team. They captured the imagination of all the gay fans and all the girls and all this kind of stuff. And then Kota Ibushi kind of wants to go his own way and do single stuff. So he goes to New Japan. He starts traveling the world over. And Kenny Omega comes to New Japan, joins Bullet Club, starts doing the junior heavyweight thing. But they're kept apart by kayfabe and New Japan so that they cannot really interact with each other. And this is where, again, you started blurring the lines, where Kenny Omega's talking about how New Japan kept them apart. They couldn't travel together. They couldn't be seen in public together. So they weren't even allowed to socialize, the two of them, during the early days of him in Bullet Club. They show some clips of Omega wrestling AJ Styles for the New Japan IWGP belt. And Omega, just by being on the same scene as Kota Ibushi when they haven't been in the same frame for so long, it was a distraction for Ibushi, and Ibushi loses. And I really like that too. I thought that was very interesting. Again, this is better storytelling when it's compact, when you can see it instead of being stretched out over so many years. When you also consider 2017, this is where Omega starts getting sort of the push towards the main event, and they start telling the story. Meltzer and all these guys are like, Kenny Omega is in an interesting place where he's separated from Kota Ibushi. He's on the darker side of wrestling right now. He can't beat Okada. Okada is in a situation where he's being built up as a god, as Meltzer is saying. So Omega sees an opportunity to wrestle Kota Ibushi. I believe it was the 2017 G1. He wants to wrestle Kota Ibushi in the finals, but he never get that opportunity. They show some footage of him taunting Kota Ibushi, him basically making challenges and demanding to face Kota Ibushi in the main event. But they end up meeting each other backstage afterwards, and they didn't say much to each other, but the scene was there. It's about creating tension, that you finally see these two guys together. And then 2018, you get the Bullet Club Civil War, where Ibushi is beat up by the Bullet Club and Kenny Omega saves him. And then afterwards, they flip that, and Omega is saved by Kota Ibushi, leading to the big reunion where they hug and they show all these female fans crying. Now Don Callis is talking as we're watching the B-roll of the girls crying. Don Callis is like, men and women are crying. I'm like, I don't see any men crying. I see a lot of women crying because we know that the women kind of they're more into the gay thing than the men are. So the women are crying. They're openly weeping. I did not know that people were that invested in the Golden Lover story. I was very impressed, actually, that people were that invested in a story. But then again, if you were in Japan at the time and you were paying close attention, then yeah, you probably would have been. The Rachel Giuliani starts talking about how female fans are often maligned for their desire to see, men in these vulnerable, emotional positions. And you do see, again, in the B-roll, all of these females crying, but they also talk about, not only is it, appealing to females, but it's also appealing to the LGBT. And these people happen to be both, in terms of they're both gay and they're female, or bisexual and female or whatever. And it appeals to them. And they said basically they're feeling represented in this story, even though there's no women in the story. They feel represented in the story. And this is what they really want. They want these guys to be together. So Kenny Omega basically talks about, again, the gay stuff, saying he never wanted to shy away from the gay community. He just wanted to tell human stories. He's always been a supporter of that community. Now he talks about it like he's not gay. Like, oh, I'm a big supporter of that community. Like it's over there, not our community, which is kind of how Effie would talk about it. Effie's openly, flamboyantly gay, while Kenny Omega is kind of, I don't know, he's not quite repressed, but, he's not coming out and, waving the flag either. So, I thought that was very interesting too. Always interesting how people choose words in these scenarios. Anyway, now that Ibushi and Omega are together again, all is right in Kenny Omega's world in terms of his character, and he's at the peak of his popularity, and he's got his best friend back, boyfriend back, however you want to phrase it. All of a sudden, he now has the confidence, the determination, the passion to fight Okada and win the belt. So that's what happens, I believe, at Dominion 2018. They show footage of the match. I thought the match was entirely too long. I think that's one of the matches that's like an hour. But then again, New Japan was known for having matches that were that long. They skipped all the rest of his time from New Japan, so from 2018 or whatever. And then they start talking about All In. And basically, this is the culmination in terms of Kenny Omega of everything that he's been doing for the last several years, is that You don't need to be a WWE Hall of Famer to be a success in this business, he says. And he wants people to realize that. He wants that to be his legacy. When he's done, is that he was able to become a success in the United States through All In and later AEW, and become a big star in Japan without wrestling in WWE. Which I will say, I'm always very impressed by that. It was similar with Sting, that to run parallel to WWE, and yes, you're on a much smaller promotion, but to attain the level of popularity that Kenny Omega has attained, it is because you have a certain level of talent. And he is an incredibly talented performer. I don't think he's, especially charismatic, but I think he is very talented, especially physically. And for him to reach the heights that he had and be a central part of one of the biggest events and one of the most important events of all time, that being All In, again, this is before AEW comes along, is impressive. And he wanted this to be his legacy, is that you don't have to work through the WWE system. You can carve out your own path, which is, as an independent contractor, every wrestler should be trying to do anyway. So I'm very impressed by that. And I'm very impressed that this is the point they decided to end on. They show Omega and Ibushi in the ring together. All In is over. He does his gimmick, mwah, bang, and all that. So him and Ibushi are changing the business together. And again, I think it was a very good documentary. Yes, I think large portions of it was basically not dedicated to telling the story of Kenny Omega, but telling the story of, hey, Kenny Omega is a pro wrestler who is doing a gay gimmick, but it's not played up for laughs. It's not a heel gimmick. It's not weird. And here's some other things that happened in the course of his career, where if this was truly a documentary about Kenny Omega, the man, I would most certainly would have expected more about his family life. I would have expected more about his influences. I would have expected a little bit more about his actual career outside of the Golden Lovers and all that stuff. So they spent a lot of time on the Golden Lovers because that's what they wanted to talk about, because that's the legacy of Kenny Omega. Not necessarily that he was a part of All In. That's important, but for the purposes of a lot of people who are involved in this thing, the real element is that he brought in the gay wrestling fan and elevated the female fans through his version of storytelling, which was largely in a homosexual relationship with Kota Ibushi. The fan base that has been cultivated by the Dirt Sheets and Kenny Omega, the largely female, the largely homosexual wrestling audience, especially a lot of the political elements that comes with that community, quote unquote, I'm not a fan of it. I think the things that they like are very off-putting to the average person who looks at pro wrestling. And by average person, I mean the mainstream. The mainstream is not LGBT activist minded. They're not. Even though people might not mind it, they might not care that much about, whether individual people are gay or individual characters are gay or whatever, something like that. The mainstream wants to see badass pro wrestling, either big jacked up dudes killing people or technically proficient, highly charismatic performers. You could be athletic, you can be a gymnast, you could be a hard hitting bruiser, whatever. But being the apple of the eye of the heavily politicized LGBT fan can be very off-putting. The way they engage with pro wrestling is very different from how other people tend to engage with the product. And that sometimes can lead to division, not unity. It sometimes can lead to conflict and not coming together. And part of it is the political element that is dangled in it, not necessarily the homosexual element, but the element of it being politicized with flags and pronouns and a lot of the other stuff that comes with it. That stuff can be very divisive. But this is a Canadian documentary. on a Canadian pro wrestler. And I absolutely understand why they went in that direction. But I wish that we had spent more time on Kenny Omega as a man, as a performer. I wish I got to learn more about his family. I wish I've gotten to learn more about him as a person. I understand he seems to be very reserved in terms of Kenny Omega talks mostly about video games and stuff like that, and almost never about his personal life, which is fine as a pro wrestler. But if you're going to do a documentary, that's what I'm interested in seeing. That's what I sat down to watch this thing for. And what I got was all the woke essays in the world about the Golden Lovers, which is, fine as a part of his career. But I would hope that there was more to it than that. And it certainly was, more to it than that, even up to this point in like 2019 where the documentary ends. But overall, I think it was okay. Wasn't the best wrestling documentary I'd ever seen, but it was all right. It wasn't terrible. What do you guys think? Did you watch it? I know I'm very late on it, but what did you guys think? And I'll talk to you guys later.
Skin tone, so why attach yourself and piggyback the wealth you didn't earn or lack yourself? I'm telling you to own up to your own success and failures. It's a reason why these